One of my favorite things about psychology is just the way we can make connections between who we were and who we are, and honestly, where we want to go. And this concept was recently, I like to make videos when real life humans, not necessarily patients, but people close to me, bring up topics. And one of them is this idea of, hi, Bear, can you say good morning? Yes, I know this thing is covered in cat hair, of reenacting our trauma. And this term, in the more formal sense, is often called repetition compulsion. It was a term coined initially by Freud, and while Freud has some problematic issues for sure, I also believe there are some really just astounding observations and concepts that we do have from Freud, which very much affect how we think of the world today. And this one is really important because the idea is that we are unconsciously often trying to rework, heal, change an internal wound or experience of wounds in our current life that were first created or originated in our often childhood or early life or in other parts of our story. And so it really is this way of engaging in patterns of behavior and thoughts and situations and feelings even when they might be harmful. And we often don't know it. And this is how we find ourselves, and we're going to go through some examples in like, God, why do I feel deja vu in this relationship? Why do I keep finding that I'm choosing these kind of partners? Why do I feel like I'm always a victim and I don't have like a victim mentality, but like, why do bad things happen to me? Sometimes that's a random one, right? I don't believe that things are meant to happen to us, but sometimes because of our choices that we don't understand, we're following a path that can sometimes feel on one level very familiar, even while we think we're charting new territory. So as a licensed psychologist, this is something that I just love to talk about because I find that the reenactment of trauma is so prolific in our lives. So that's the definition, and that's really where it came from. Now, what kind of causes this? We believe everything from, these unconscious patterns around, unresolved traumas that were never quite worked through. And remember, these traumas can be everything from a chronic toxic stress induced childhood with something like a narcissistic, immature caregiver or mentally ill sibling, something like that. It can be a snapshot in time of a traumatic event that happened to you. So we're talking about both PTSD and complex PTSD types of events. It can be a sort of defense mechanism, as it is often seen, as it is seen essentially, as a way where we are recreating these familiar experiences to kind of get a sense of control and mastery over our situation, our story, our lives. And many people believe that we're really trying to find resolution when we engage in these repetitive patterns, but they can obviously create a lot of harm. And we're really just trying to like rewrite the story and change the outcome, right? I've talked about this in so many places. When I grew up as, with a single mom and only child, never really had a full family. Even my stepfamily had its issues. All I ever wanted was a family, like beyond anything else. And on the outside, I checked a lot of boxes that gave me that. But when I unpacked it and really understood not just my partner, but the role I had in choosing and tolerating and minimizing and invalidating myself, I had really unconsciously played a very different story on the outside, but the same feelings in the inside. Feeling alone, feeling abandoned, feeling out of control, all of those things. And so that's why I think it's so important. So let's talk about some signs that you might be doing this. Number one, you might have more classic signs around revisiting trauma. Flashbacks at night, intrusive thoughts, emotional flashbacks. Remember, that's a regression to a feeling state, not necessarily a thought or memory, but how it felt. Shame, ashamed, guilty, bad, whatever it is, scared, out of control. It could be insomnia, sleep issues, nightmares. So all of those kind of classic re-experiencing symptoms. Those are going to be more obvious, right? But here's where it gets interesting. If you're thinking about this right now as you're watching this, am I doing this? I want you to think about whatever relationship is making this come up for you and try to stay away from the content of the relationship, what they do to you or don't do to you or for you, but how you feel. What are the themes around how you feel in response to this person and relationship? And then what do you do? Are you acting as if those feelings are, coming from that person, for example, in a partner or whatever, but they're not, right? So that's the goal. So number 2, fear of abandonment and or engulfment. This is really classic in those of us who have really any insecure attachment pattern. But if you go back and forth between abandonment and engulfment, it's very possible you might have had a parent who displayed more disorganized attachment patterns. And then, of course, engulfing and consuming, that can come from a more anxious or fearful place. Abandonment can come from anxiety, and even the way an avoidant might engage. It's like you're longing for connection but never having it. So any trigger about that someone might leave you, you might, kind of like wall up. And or if you feel like they're trying to consume you and engulf you, you're going to be very resistant to that because that is not going to feel safe for you. Number 3, trust and intimacy issues. When we're reenacting trauma, we're often reenacting the same dynamics that we were available at the time to receive in the relationship, right? So this idea that you can only choose partners who are as healed as you are or unhealed, I think there's some value to that. Not necessarily always. I think we can also work to be drawn to more secure partners and grow together. But this idea that, it takes a lot to really be intimate and be mentally and physically present, not just dissociated from your body, or to truly believe and trust that someone will have your back, to even consider asking for help. That is very hard for many of us, especially when we had complicated childhoods. Number 4, my big one, chronic hypervigilance. This idea that when you're reenacting trauma, because often you're in the same situation, you're scanning for it to be different, but you're scanning nonetheless. So monitoring, emotionally monitoring, physically monitoring, everything that looks like I need to be mindful of what's coming next and what I should do in response. That can be an old story for you. Number 5, repeatedly finding yourself in abusive, harmful, toxic relationships. And like I just said, with partners who maybe they don't do anything like the other partner. For example, I've talked about my partner did not scream and yell at all until the very end when there were a bunch of things going on. But the point is that the feeling was the same. Being alone, being abandoned, not being understood and seen, things like that. Number 6, acting out, really finding yourself doing things that are destructive, from substance abuse or harm to risk-taking behaviors, overspending. You can find yourself putting yourself mentally, physically, or emotionally, essentially in actively self-harm or harming yourself in some way that is familiar. And there's lots of reasons why we do that, but of course that's possible. And then just putting yourself in situations where it's almost like a form of self-sabotage. You're more likely to fail or be disregarded or disappointed, though when you go into it, you don't think that's possible at all, but that is the final outcome. Number 7, feeling like numb and detached and really avoidant. That in a relationship of reenactment, maybe you are beginning to detect it, or maybe that's what you did in childhood. So you seek out partners who never fully can be close to you because they'll never really be safe or trustworthy or let you in. Or you're just always in a sort of low-key numbed out state from smoking weed or drinking or binge watching or dissociating. Whatever it is, there's this sort of massive detachment from real connection, but you often don't see it. And maybe you're actively, engaging in those things. Number 8, you feel like you're stuck in a loop. It's like you say to yourself, why do I keep finding partners like this? Why does this happen? Or it feels like a sense of deja vu. It just feels familiar. Even though the partner seems so different. And oftentimes it has nothing to do with that partner. Like I'm saying, it's all to do with you. So you're repeating things, engaging in routines or patterns. All of it is just like very familiar repetition in some way. Number 9, having anger issues or being conflict avoidant, as I talk so much about in certain childhoods. Anger can be dangerous. Either we act it out ourselves and all we have is 0 to 60 like our parents, or we completely avoid anything that gets close to it. And so you find yourself in a relationship avoiding saying what you think, avoiding setting boundaries, but resentful. Remember, resentment is the number one sign you need to set more boundaries for yourself. Number 10, unexplained emotional reactivity. It's like blowing up on someone, being triggered. And when you look back on it, you're like, oh my God, I don't know why I did that. They didn't even do anything that was that big of a deal. Or you're just walking around kind of low-key pissed and triggered and don't really know why. And perhaps there are elements of this relationship that mirror your wounds or the unresolved traumas or even the behavioral patterns of your previous caregivers or partners. Number 11, kind of unexplained concentration issues, focusing issues. It's like your executive dysfunction is all over the place, and it might be more activated in certain states in the relationship, but especially if you're like, you just feel foggy, you can't get clear on something, and you can't put your finger on what's going on in the relationship, but you keep telling yourself that something's wrong. There could be something wrong, and it could also be you sort of kind of remanifesting what you grew up with. And number 12, seeking out situations that remind you of your trauma through something like movies, books, social media. It's almost like you keep putting yourself in those situations. And as someone who has used films in therapy, I think that actually watching a film and it can tap into parts of yourself that you are not aware of. And there can be this healing in it. And many of us have our comfort shows, movies that we watch and rewatch. And I think that obviously the familiarity and predictability and all of that, for example, with a more neurodivergent brain can be great. But I also think sometimes we're really working through something. And this is a great thing. If you watch something and you think, I don't know why I cried at that, and you're in therapy, go talk about it, right? Or like I said, I watched that Ruby Frankie documentary a couple weeks ago, or a week and a half ago, and I could not stop thinking about the little girl when the police got her. And it was about her, but it really wasn't. It was about my connecting to her. So especially if you keep ruminating on a phrase of TikTok, a video, a movie, a show, and what the characters are feeling, there's often so much rich data and emotional material to mine from that. So either doing it on your own, journaling about it, whatever. Obviously, if you're lucky enough to have a good therapist, to talk about it there. So underlying, we do this, as I said, is unconscious attempts to gain control, to seek familiarity and predictability, to sort of try to get it right this time. And so that's why we're doing it. What can help? Certainly something like therapy with a great trusted resource, attachment work, listening to books or podcasts that help you tap in to earlier traumas that might be unresolved, EMDR, letting yourself, if it feels safe, because it's not the case that you need to feel everything. Sometimes it's better to keep some things capped away. But if you feel like in a safe way, it would be good for you to really let yourself feel and walk through something in a safe place, and you're able to do that, to kind of work through it, that can be helpful. Looking for patterns. This is where I think especially neurodivergent people are so good at understanding their trauma, is that there's often this pattern recognition that can happen. It's like I said, when I got it took me 10 minutes in therapy to connect the Ruby Frankie daughter to my own trauma around the end of my marriage and childhood. And literally it was released. It did not bother me for one more second. And when I thought about it, I only had compassion for her. It had nothing to do with me, right? So looking for that. So writing to yourself, writing to your inner child, writing to your future self, looking at writing to the feeling, where is this familiar? Being a detective, I talk about so much. What is happening for you? And then obviously things like, inner child work, reparenting, trauma therapies, all of those things. Courses, of course I'm biased because I really did. I don't market these courses. I don't make ads with them, and my editors on my book were saying you guys in your field, you create these things and then you don't want to push selling them. And I think that makes sense, but it's also like they said to me, when you reframe it, that this is something you care about as a passion and it can help people, it changes. And so I'm working on how to do that. I mostly just kind of stick up, images of my books or whatever I'm doing or sharing with you or the courses and things like that. So it's hard for me to do that. I will have to work harder at that, as I do want to share the book. I'll be coming out in quite some time from now. It takes a while, but it will be all connected to all of these topics. So anyway, Thanks for being here. Have a beautiful day. I hope this was helpful. And I really do think it also is a place to find compassion when we want to beat ourselves up and say, oh my God, why did you do that again? It's important to come from that inner parent, because you're also the inner parent and the inner child, and to say, you know what, you were doing the best you could. You didn't know what you didn't know, and that's okay. And now you do, right? And so just making little changes. You can't necessarily shake the entire snow globe and get rid of it, but maybe little baby steps, acknowledging the work, leaning in, having compassion, all those things. Or just reaching out for your first, maybe a therapy appointment can be helpful, and beginning that process, whatever that looks like. So anyway, have a beautiful day, and I'll see you tomorrow. Take care. Bye.